Hello and welcome to today's lecture on cultural diplomacy and international economics. In today's lecture, I would like to run through 6 different points. First of all, I would like to say a few words of introduction about the role of economics and the private sector in today's globalized world. In the sense, what is the connection between the economic bridges and the cultural bridges? Then I'd like to discuss briefly the concept of corporate social responsibility, CSR. Then I would like to outline the principles for responsible investment of the United Nations and the UN Global Compact to see what is being done from the global governance side to try to work in the field of international economics and engage the private sector together with the public sector in the context of international economics when it comes to corporate cultural diplomacy and beyond. Then I would like to give a definition of corporate cultural diplomacy. And then I'd like to give 3 examples to help us understand not only what's being done right now when it comes to corporate cultural diplomacy, but what can be done in the future. And for that, I will have a brief video excerpt outlining the concept of patient capital. Then we will do a case study from British Petroleum, and then a case study from Deutsche Bank, where you can see the tremendous potential that there is actually for engagement when it comes to corporate cultural diplomacy. In concluding, I'd like to then give a few prospects and prognosis of what the future of cultural diplomacy and international economics can hold. So let's begin talking a little bit about the role that economics can play, as well as the private sector, in today's globalized world. If we look at the current situation of the world, we've already established that we live in an interdependent world. So whether we like it or not, we can't just do our own thing as countries and as companies, but we have to somehow acknowledge the fact that we are living and we are working in an interdependent world, a world really where we are connected, we need to work together. And I think that is true of global politics when it comes to tackling issues such as climate change or poverty or terrorism. That's true when it comes to business, in the sense even the smallest of businesses today are realizing the more open they are to globalization and also new markets, the more their profits can increase and also their performance. So in that sense, really across the board, I would argue, when it comes to economics, the private sector, also there's a recognition that we live in an interdependent world. Culturally speaking, goes without saying, as we've addressed in the earlier lectures, we really do need to also look at our strategies of cultural diplomacy and beyond, recognizing the fact that it's an interdependent world. Therefore, let's talk about economics. Or let's talk more specifically about economic bridges and cultural bridges. The thesis that we have is that we can actually connect the two. One specific example to get the ball rolling, the Perez Center for Peace is an NGO based in Israel that does a lot of work actually trying to bring Israelis and Palestinians together. Their logic is that actually economic bridges can help to bring peace and also cultural bridges. In a situation where you have almost no trust, very little understanding, and very limited dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians, the Perez Center is saying, look, let's get these individuals working together. If you have business, if you have trade between Israelis and Palestinians, they're less likely to fight each other. If you have investment in a city or a country, you're less likely to bomb that country. And the idea is how one can strengthen a cultural bridge also, or even bring peace when it comes to economics. That's the essential idea when we talk about cultural diplomacy and international economics. The Institute for Cultural Diplomacy is very engaged in this field as well, and is currently doing a lot of research, in particular in the field that we've developed and we've called corporate cultural diplomacy, taking very much the same idea of actually strengthening the economic bridge in order to strengthen the cultural bridge, and ideally to do the two simultaneously. So that's the big picture that we're going to be discussing in this lecture. What I'd like to begin with is a concept which is not so easy to define. It's an emerging field, corporate social responsibility, and in many ways can mean a variety of different things. So I'm actually going to share with you 3 different definitions to try to get a little bit of clarity. What is CSR? Then we'll be able to take it to the next level and ask what is corporate social responsibility and corporate cultural diplomacy in that sense. So let's begin with the first definition. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, the idea that a company should be interested in and willing to help society and the environment, as well as be concerned about products and profits it makes. Very simple definition of corporate social responsibility. This idea that what a company does, they've got to be responsible as a company itself, but also to society. That ideally their activities would benefit society as well as benefiting the company. Short and simple. Second definition that I'd like to share with you is from Wikipedia. Corporate social responsibility, CSR, also called corporate conscience, corporate citizenship, social performance, or sustainably responsible business, is a form of corporate self-regulation integrated into the business model. CSR policy functions as a built-in, self-regulating mechanism whereby a business monitors and ensures that its active compliance with the spirit of law, ethical standards, and international norms. The goal of CSR is to embrace responsibility for the company's actions and encourage a positive impact through its activities on the environment, consumers, employees, communities, stakeholders, and all other members of the public sphere who may also be considered as stakeholders. So it's a more elaborate definition trying to show again the spectrum that can actually be involved in CSR. They're referring to a field indirectly here, which we should mention in this discussion as well, SRI, socially responsible investments. You really have two levels. There's the corporate social responsibility, which is primarily dealing with the corporation and its clients or customers, those relationships. Then you have socially responsible investment, which is more the investor side. At the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, we feel that the more correlation between both of these fields, the better. So if we can have SRI strategies working together with CSR strategies, that's for the benefit of the company, in our opinion, as well as for society. So that is the second definition that I wanted to share with you of corporate social responsibility. The third definition is actually taken from the Harvard University Corporate Social Responsibility Initiative of the John F. Kennedy School of Government, and it says the following. We define corporate social responsibility strategically. Corporate social responsibility encompasses not only what companies do with their profits, but also how they make them. It goes beyond philanthropy and compliance and addresses how companies manage their economic, social, and environmental impacts, as well as their relationships in all key spheres of influence. The workplace, the marketplace, the supply chain, the community, and the public policy realm. I like this definition from Harvard University, I think, the best, because it really does imply we've got to practice what we preach. In the sense, really what happens within a company, in its workplace and its headquarters, which is maybe in a different country than where it also has operations, in the operations itself, and the communities in which it's active. Very, very important that really at every level of the corporation's engagement, they are really being true to the responsibility that they have to themselves as companies, to their employees, as well as to society, those locally that they interact with, as well as globally. So I'd suggest that we take maybe this third definition as a reference point for the rest of this lecture. Where, as I said, I'm trying to outline on the one hand at the global governance level, what is the UN Global Compact, we'll see in a moment, and then I want to get specific in terms of also what can companies specifically do to actually have an impact when it comes to corporate cultural diplomacy, and how can international economics also, and the field of international economics, be more engaged to actually assist in educating, enhancing, and sustaining relationships around the world. So what I'd like to do now that we've established the definition of corporate cultural diplomacy, corporate social responsibility, is to take it to the global level for a moment. What does the UN have to say about all of this? Principles for Responsible Investment of the United Nations. In 2005, the United Nations Secretary General, in coordination with the United Nations Environment Program, Finance Initiative, and the UN Global Compact, invited a group of the world's largest institutional investors to join a process in developing the principles. PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investment, is an initiative and a set of aspirational and voluntary guidelines for investments entities wishing to address environmental, social, and corporate governance, or ESG, issues. Over 850 companies have signed up to these principles. So note that it is voluntary. Companies don't have to do this, but out of their own free will, 850 companies said, yes, we want to be part of this. We want to live by these standards. Individuals representing 20 institutional investors from 12 countries participated in this process, supported by a 70-person, multi-stakeholder group of experts from the investment industry, intergovernmental and governmental organizations, civil society, and academia. The process was conducted between April 2005 and January 2006, and the principles themselves were launched by Kofi Annan at the New York Stock Exchange in April 2006. As institutional investors, and here I'll read to you a portion of the text from the PRI. As institutional investors, we have a duty to act in the best long-term interests of our beneficiaries. In this fiduciary role, we believe that environmental, social, and corporate governance (ESG) issues can affect the performance of investment portfolios to varying degrees across companies, sectors, regions, asset classes, and through time. We also recognize that applying these principles may better align investors with broader objectives of society. Therefore, where consistent with our fiduciary responsibilities, we commit to the following. And here you can see some of the most important issues in which they're agreeing and in which they're committing voluntarily. I'll read those in a moment. The unveiling of the PRI at the New York Stock Exchange in 2006 was attended by the PRI signatories and the former UN Secretary General, Kofi Annan. And let me read to you, let's say, 6 of the most important principles. 1. We will incorporate ESG issues into investment analysis and decision-making processes. 2. We will be active owners and incorporate ESG issues into our ownership policies and practices. 3. We will seek appropriate disclosure on ESG issues by the entities in which we invest. 4. We will promote acceptance and implementation of the principles within the investment industry. 5. We will work together to enhance our effectiveness in implementing the principles. 6. We will each report on our activities and progress towards implementing the principles. And of course, this last point is very important. Without the reporting, how does anyone even know, are these companies really doing this or not? So it's a big standard, and it's really a high bar that companies are saying, all right, we want to live by this bar. And I think companies, in my opinion, are doing this for 2 reasons. First of all, because they actually do want to make a difference, and they do actually want positive things to happen in society. They want to be really responsible actors. Secondly, the markets are demanding it. If you look at today's advertisements, for example, for cars, you'll notice you see less advertisements talking about big motors and speed and power of cars. You're finding many more ads talking about how efficient the car is, how fuel efficient it is it using renewable energies, etc. And you can see really a change in the markets. And I think there we as consumers have a very important responsibility as well. What do we expect of the companies? Do we drink fair traded coffee? Do we drink normal coffee? Do we drive an electric car, or do we drive a gas guzzling SUV? So in that sense, I think not because only companies want to do this, but I think also companies have to do this. I think for a company to be sustainable in the future, they need to actually be responsible, and they need to act responsibly. And I think that's where corporate cultural diplomacy can assist. I think right now it is voluntary. This initiative of the United Nations is voluntary, but I think before too long it will no longer be voluntary. And I think you already are seeing a number of examples today where companies can actually increase their profits by acting more responsibly. And you can see many cases where companies are losing profits by not acting responsibility. As we look at the Arab Spring, as we look at Occupy Wall Street, you can see indications that actually there's a level of, how does one say this, patience amongst consumers and amongst citizens of the world. Once that level gets passed, there will be repercussions. And I think companies need to be aware of this, and they are aware of this, which is why we're also seeing more and more of an emphasis in the field of international economics. What can actually private sector do when it comes to cultural diplomacy? So I wanted to begin with those 2 definitions. First of all, what is corporate social responsibility? Secondly, what is the United Nations Global Compact and also these principles of responsible investment, PRI? What I would now like to do is to zero in a little bit on corporate cultural diplomacy. And before I give you a definition of corporate cultural diplomacy, I'd like to show you the following brief video. It's a very interesting video which will outline for you the concept of patient capital and the potential that it has for the future of corporate culture diplomacy. So before we begin with the corporate culture diplomacy, please take a moment, take a look at this video, listen very carefully, and in particular, I think as you're watching the video, ask yourself the question, all right, how can a company really take from this example and become more and more engaged? What I very much like about the video is it shows you in a very specific, very concrete way how you can actually make a big difference through sometimes very small investments and very small levels of engagement for companies. So the point is, if it works with those small specific examples, the sky is the limit when you come to also bigger examples. So I hope you enjoy and find this video helpful. Okay, ready? Okay. So now that we've had a chance to understand better the context and also the potential for how the private sector can engage through the field of international economics in cultural diplomacy activities, I'd like to discuss more specifically what we mean by corporate cultural diplomacy. Corporate social responsibility, CSR, programs are dedicated to activities that ensure the company is operating in a responsible way towards its local, national, and global environments. For example, a company might work to counteract externalities like pollution, or create a foundation dedicated to providing educational grants to students who would otherwise be unable to afford college. CSR is a key factor of cultural diplomacy as well, helping to build dialogue, understanding, and trust between companies and their clients, as well as potential clients, all over the world through grants, exchange programs, and sponsored community initiatives. The stronger the relationships between the company and its clients, the more trust will grow, and the easier it will be to foster both consumer activity and general goodwill towards the corporation. Corporate culture diplomacy helps present a more accurate and comprehensive picture of particular corporate environments and the ethical standards a company subscribes to. By initiating campaigns to counter misconceptions regarding its activities, a company can increase credibility and legitimacy while simultaneously heightening its local, national, and global profiles. This strategy can go a long way towards mitigating potential conflicts. So as we saw also in a brief video about patient capital, the key thing with corporate culture diplomacy, according to the ICD, is that corporate culture diplomacy initiatives should not just be initiatives that are gifts to society. It shouldn't just be a charity where we throw money at some problem. Corporate culture diplomacy, the most successful forms, actually should fulfill two goals. They should help the community or society at large, and they should help the company. And I think there, if you can fulfill these two goals, it's much more likely to succeed. As much faith as I have in the private sector, I don't think we can assume that they will do things just to be good and just because they want to save the world. At the end of the day, the biggest priority for for-profit companies, of course, is increasing their profits, and that's okay. So I think these initiatives, if they can help the company to increase their profits as well as their performance and give a benefit to society, then you're going to see much more activity from the private sector. And I think there, we'll see a few examples in a moment, specifically of corporate culture diplomacy, but I think if we really are going to see a greater engagement from the private sector at a worldwide level, we need to fulfill both. Initially, the idea of CSR was really, okay, let's go and do a few things to help society, people will like us, and we can then have less backlash and continue maybe ruining the world in some cases. So where you have actually contradictory situations. A company on the one hand is maybe damaging certain parts of the world with the environment, and on the other hand, trying to regain its name and its reputation through other activities. Those contradictions also won't hold. I think for a certain period of time, one can, of course, maybe through advertising campaigns, improve an image or send certain counter images. But at the end of the day, in today's world of WikiLeaks and social media, etc., it's pretty difficult for companies to hide anymore. And it's pretty difficult for you to really have counteractive policies. Let's say a corporate environment which is maybe very destructive, and a CSR campaign which is then more positive. So another key lesson learned, consistency. Companies really do need to practice what they preach. The truth will come out, as they say. So in that sense, the best corporate cultural diplomacy initiatives that we've seen are those which benefit the company, which benefit society, and are consistent with actually the official responsibilities that company actually projects to the outside world. So what I'd like to do now to make it a little bit clearer for you is give you two specific examples of corporate culture diplomacy. The ICD actually has done, once a year, we do a big publication called Culture Diplomacy Outlook. In Culture Diplomacy Outlook, we do a number of things, but essentially we're trying to give an assessment of what has been the main contributions of the private sector, public sector, and civil society during that year in the field of culture diplomacy. We also, as part of this, do a ranking of actually private sector engagement in the field of corporate culture diplomacy. So the two companies that I'm going to share with you now, Deutsche Bank and BP, have actually rated very high in our ranking, not necessarily because of the companies themselves and what the companies are doing in terms of their for-profit activities, but rather in terms of what they're doing in terms of corporate culture diplomacy. So let's first take a look at Deutsche Bank. ICD is based in Germany, as you know, so we're very familiar also with the company Deutsche Bank. But let me give you a few basic facts about the bank itself first, and then we can look a little bit at its activities. Deutsche Bank is a leading global investment bank offering financial products and services for corporate and institutional clients, along with private and business clients. Deutsche Bank has a presence in over 70 countries. A three-member team set out, and what I'd like to do now actually is give you a few examples about Deutsche Bank, so in terms of the engagement that they're doing. First example is the following. A three-member team set out on a 4-week volunteering project in May to Ethiopia under Deutsche Bank's Corporate and Community Partnership Scheme. Their task is to analyze and recommend management information systems, solutions to microfinance organization named Poverty Eradication and Community Empowerment based in Addis Ababa. So a specific example where Deutsche Bank says, all right, let's send our team in there and actually do something specifically to help this local community. It's a very interesting example. In contrast to other companies that maybe have bigger, more macro level events, here you have really a company going in, zooming in something very specific, trying to respond to a specific need, using the resources and the expertise they have. Second example I'd like to share with you is the following. Deutsche Bank supported a project which involved 720 students from 4 London-based secondary schools who had the opportunity to have a 3-year learning partnership at the British Museum. The Cultures and Contact program, as it's called, aims to bring life the context and history that has led to the development of the modern world. So again, this is almost in the spirit of Erasmus or DAAD, where Deutsche Bank says, all right, our role, let's facilitate access to opportunities for individuals. So in this case, 720 students were able to have access to this opportunity at the British Museum, thanks to Deutsche Bank. Next example that I'd like to give you is maybe one of the stronger examples, where the Deutsche Bank has actually created a cultural institution themselves, the Deutsche Guggenheim Museum. Each year, the Deutsche Guggenheim presents 4 first-rate exhibitions with a focus upon the art of the 20th and 21st century. With its 350 square meters, the exhibition area is an ideal space for a detailed focus on particular themes, as well as on groups or works created by individual artists or typical and specific trends. The exhibition hall transforms itself again and again from one presentation to the next. It always changes depending on the exhibition, and offers surprises with fresh spatial aspects. The multifaceted program of the Deutsche Guggenheim, which is developed through the intense collaboration between 2 partners, is comprised of 3 major elements. Alongside the exhibitions devoted to the individual artists or themes, and enriched by works on loan from international museums, institutions, and private collections, the gallery presents each year an exhibition with the works from the Deutsche Bank collection. The most unique aspect, however, consists of the presentation of site-specific works commissioned for the exhibition hall. So what's fascinating here is a number of things. First of all, as we think of other examples of cultural diplomacy, let's say America House that we discussed in the earlier lecture. America House was initially designed to be a physical space to allow for cultural engagements to take place. So again, this aspect of facilitating cultural exchange. I look at this example of corporate cultural diplomacy the same way. Here you have a private sector firm, Deutsche Bank, that's saying, all right, let's create not only a banking space, which we already have, let's create a cultural space. And that cultural space has nothing to do with banking, has nothing to do with our company, but it has everything to do with what we believe in. And Deutsche Bank as a company believes that culture is, of course, very important, that really the cultural aspects of our identity, for some, are actually the most important, more important than our passport or our profession, etc., but really our culture. Some say that culture is the reason why we all live. We work and we do all of this to actually be able to enjoy those cultural aspects. So culture is important for Deutsche Bank, and they really want to show that to the world. So I think as part of their corporate cultural diplomacy, what they've done is created a public space where cultural engagement and cultural interaction can take place. Partially, they're a host to other exhibitions from around the world. As they also mentioned, they also have site-specific works. So where actually Deutsche Bank says, you know what, we really want to have an art exhibition focusing on this. And they actually very often will deal with actually very important topics, such as integration, multiculturalism, through actually the art exhibitions. So it's really a 2-tiered approach, where the Deutsche Bank on the one hand is receiving exhibitions from the Guggenheim in New York, etc., and also saying, look, we want an exhibition to focus on this issue and this issue, where they have tours ranging from high school kids to young leaders to also elites and decision makers coming through the space. So that's the first thing that I think is interesting about this example of corporate cultural diplomacy. The second thing is, of course, for Deutsche Bank as a company, they have a benefit here also. I think here you're presenting a bank, normally associated with money and profit, etc., in a cultural context. So the people that come to the Deutsche Guggenheim, they see the Deutsche Bank logo there. They understand how this all came about, but it's a cultural space. There's no banking going on here. It's cultural engagement. So that's a way for Deutsche Bank also to show what actually it has merit in, what it has importance in. A similar example of this would be the sponsorship of the Berlin Philharmonic from Deutsche Bank, where again they're saying, all right, music is important. We're a German company. We want to also invest in German culture. And in that sense, they're making an investment in a very important musical expression of the German culture through the Berlin Philharmonic. So those are both examples where a company on the one hand can really improve its profile, also create its profile, show sort of those values, those aspects of culture that matter to it. At the same time, I think make a valuable contribution to cultural diplomacy. And I think there's cultural diplomacy and cultural engagement that can take place in the Deutsche Guggenheim that probably couldn't take place before that Deutsche Guggenheim was there. So one specific example from Deutsche Bank, there are many more examples. Deutsche Bank has actually 12 major wings actually of cultural diplomacy. Deutsche Bank Americas Foundation, through the CSR efforts, through the Berlin Philharmonic, through the Deutsche Guggenheim. I'm just giving you a few examples here just to demonstrate what we mean when we say corporate cultural diplomacy. I'd like to give you a second example, again, just to make it clear. This time not a German company, but actually a British company, British Petroleum. I'll leave aside the company itself and the many controversies that have come with it and that may be there now. And I want to really zero in, not so much on the company, but on the actual initiatives that they have when it comes to cultural engagement. First of all, just very briefly, British Petroleum is a global oil and gas company headquartered in London, United Kingdom. It's the third largest energy company and the fourth largest company in the world, measured by revenues, and one of the 6 oil and gas super majors. It is vertically integrated and is active in every area of the oil and gas industry, including exploration and production, refining, distribution, marketing, petrochemicals, power generation, and trading. It also has major renewable energy activities, including biofuels, hydrogen, solar, and wind power. BP has operations in over 80 countries, produces roughly 3.8 million barrels of oil equivalent per day, and has 22,400 service stations worldwide. Its largest division is BP America, which is the biggest producer of oil and gas in the United States and is headquartered in Houston, Texas. As of December 31st, 2010, BP had a total proven commercial reserves of 18.7 billion barrels of oil equivalent. So it's a big company, which is important to note for 2 reasons. First of all, it's active around the world. Second of all, it's a great opportunity for them to also practice culture diplomacy and corporate culture diplomacy within their company. You've got many different countries involved here, many different ethnicities, many different cultures. So that's an opportunity also for a company, a global company like this, to really also practice culture diplomacy within the workplace. But I want to give a few examples of actually what BP is doing outside of its workplace in terms of engagement of corporate culture diplomacy. First of all, BP invests in culture diplomacy by sponsoring over £100,000 for the City of London and New Zealand Committee, which aims to support the cultural bridges between New Zealand and the United Kingdom, and to strengthen diplomatic relations between 2 countries. Classical culture diplomacy, basically establishing a bridge between 2 countries, in this case is United Kingdom and New Zealand, and trying to educate, enhance, and sustain that relationship through the culture diplomacy activities. So again, perfect example of BP bringing 2 countries that are important for it also strategically together with culture diplomacy. Second example I'd like to highlight, British Petroleum is also a sponsor of the London Cultural Olympiad 2012, of which the London 2012 Open Weekend is a highlight. In July, the Open Weekend marked the countdown to the Games with hundreds of arts, cultural, and sports events open to everyone from around the country. Over 1 million people took part in the Open Weekend events between the 22nd and the 24th of July. Also an interesting example where you have a private sector company, again, sponsoring something that will actually facilitate culture diplomacy. Many would see sports as one of the most powerful vehicles of culture diplomacy. We'll illustrate this in one of our upcoming lectures more specifically, but I think there's something special also about the Olympics. I think it's rare when one has an opportunity for actually basically every country of the world to come together in competition, but really also in terms of exchange. We've seen many examples where the Olympics has actually not done culture diplomacy and sometimes caused problems, but we've also seen many examples where it actually has helped to build bridges. And I think very moving in particular was in South Africa when we had the Olympics. There really also the recognition that was actually made at a number of levels in terms of the great reconciliation that was done, and then also I think some allusions to the work that still needs to be done. And I think there in the case of South Africa, obviously given its history where soccer and sports really did help in the reconciliation process, that was really I think a great expression, and once the Olympics were there, to see this at the international level. And in some of the cultural performances in South Africa, they really made reference to that. So I think this idea, this year of BP getting engaged in the Olympics is quite interesting. On the one hand, you could say it has nothing to do with their core business. On the other hand, I think it is a way of BP showing this is important to us. We really want to make sure that this international example of culture diplomacy, the Olympics, really take shape in a great way. And they wanted to make sure that culture was present as well as music in addition to the sports activity. So second interesting example of how a big company like BP can get involved. Third example I'd like to share, and actually the final example, is the British Petroleum supporting the Royal Opera House by organizing summer big screens where ballet and opera concerts are held. All the screenings are free of charge in order to encourage and support the love of the cultural activity. What I find interesting here is, again, access. BP is helping to give access to something that normally there isn't much access. Many would see the opera as a relatively elite phenomena. It tends to be expensive to get in. Usually a limited group of citizens in any given city or country would actually experience opera. And in Europe, for example, many think it would not exist opera were it not for governmental subsidies. So in that sense, there seems to be really a need to kind of support this somewhat limited target audience that enjoys opera. So what BP is doing is saying, look, we want every citizen to experience opera, and we're going to help to enable it. So by setting up these big screens, it's actually open to the public. You can come there. It doesn't matter what your walk of life is. It doesn't matter what you're wearing. It doesn't matter what's on your business card. And you can experience this high culture, traditionally seen high culture performance on the street. So I think, again, a very interesting idea. What's also fascinating, you could go a level deeper, is if you look then who is actually there in this public setting, you've got probably the best cross-section of society. There on the streets of the city is really a meeting place. And I think their interaction can also take place that maybe wouldn't take place sitting in a formal opera house, everyone with their ties, and people yelling at you if you sneeze too loud. Here you are on the streets, and I think there can be a thing where families can come together, really citizens of all backgrounds, in a second level of cultural diplomacy. So the first level of this corporate cultural diplomacy is the fact that they're supporting something cultural by the opera house. The second level is they're actually giving access to this culture to everyone. And I think those both components make it an interesting example of corporate cultural diplomacy, how a corporation that has nothing to do with culture per se in terms of its core business can really act as an enabler, as well as a sponsor, as well as a funder of cultural diplomacy to take place at a number of levels. So I want to stop there in terms of the examples, but I'm hoping that this lecture was helpful for you in terms of seeing the potential that there is really for further private sector engagement, and really in the context of international economics, where cultural diplomacy has a very important role, and where, let's say, the private sector and also the international economic sphere as a whole has a big potential for engagement in cultural diplomacy. Traditionally, as we all know, cultural diplomacy was the business of governments. It was the matter, how do we win the hearts and minds of foreign audiences? Today, what I think we've seen through this lecture, as well as through the previous lectures, is that, first of all, the power of partnership is key. The private sector, which we focused on today, together with the public sector, which was the traditional main agent of cultural diplomacy, together with civil society. And I'm hoping today was clear for you in terms of really illustrating, again, what can be done. I think, unfortunately, if we look as a whole at the field of international economics in the world, you don't see so much engagement when it comes to corporate cultural diplomacy. On the other hand, there are some good examples. Some of them we saw today, and I'm hoping that this will also inspire you to perhaps help us to have further examples. And I think, again, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, the key secret for success for the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy is partnership. Public sector, private sector, civil society. I hope this was interesting for you, and I look forward to continuing with the next lecture. Thank you.